if they're not getting hired or promoted, it's not because they're Jewish, it's because they're white and they're male and they don't fit into the intersectional categories.
Hello and welcome back to the Americano Show. Today we are going to be talking about Black Lives Matter, the second in our series about Black Lives Matter, because we are approaching the 5th anniversary of that summer, that extraordinary summer of 2020 when the world seemed to be going madder than ever. And I'm delighted to be joined to discuss this subject by Heather MacDonald, who is a fellow at the Manhattan Institute and the author of When Race Trumps Merit. Heather, you're joining us from California. Thank you for coming on. 5 years on from Black Lives Matter, how do you look back at that summer?
It was a summer of absolute anarchy and the near collapse of civilization, whose effects continue to be felt today every time an American goes to a drugstore and finds that the toothpaste is locked up and the criminals who are at risk of stealing it are not. We have ratcheted down our expectations for civilized behavior. We live on the edge of yet more mass looting events, mass anarchy events. Just this last Saturday in Los Angeles, there was a rampaging crowd that covered police cars with graffiti right next to them, broke windows, covered every retail establishment around with graffiti, subway cars, out of just sheer destructive venom. So the perpetrators of the violence of that summer that we've put out of our mind, it's kind of like our response to the COVID insanity. We've just decided, let's not look back at that. The perpetrators were barely punished. We hear constantly about the January 6th Capitol rioters and their punishments, and anybody that was engaged in violence and attacks on officers on January 6th, of course, should be punished to the full extent of the law. But the people who spent days ransacking businesses, stealing from pharmacies, that have resulted in permanent closures and decimation of business districts in Minneapolis and elsewhere, we never hear about them. And the message was sent that this type of behavior will be justified in the name of, and I put this in about 3 levels of scare quotes, racial justice.
If that summer of 2020 was the sort of peak of near anarchy in the US, it's often said or thought today that the Trump administration is a kind of corrective to that. But from your description of America today, you don't think the correction has really happened yet?
Well, it's a question, what happens to a civilization when there's that degree of anarchy with no consequences? And we've had outbreaks since then of similar contempt for the law, whether it's the celebration of the cold-blooded assassination of a healthcare executive by Luigi Mangione, who became a folk hero, whether it's the terroristic attack on 2 workers for the Israeli embassy several weekends ago, these and the attacks on Tesla dealerships, Tesla cars, the idea that you get to engage in violence for causes that you believe in, I think has been normalized to a certain extent. Now, what the significance of the Trump election was is up for grabs, and everybody wants to read into any event his own favorite causes. So, of course, yes, I, as somebody who has opposed racial victimology, who opposes disparate impact analysis, who completely disagrees with the analysis that America is today systemically racist, would like to believe that the reason Trump was elected was because Americans have finally said enough with the race grift. We're not going to, the heterosexual white male is no longer going to accept being demonized on 0 grounds. But I'm not sure. It may be that Trump was elected because the economy was bad or because he promised to close the borders. That having been said, he certainly has been very busy in rolling out executive orders that do uh, take head on the lies that the Black Lives Matter movement embodied, above all with regards to white Americans' inherited collective guilt and their ongoing alleged uh, activities of white supremacy.
Well, a lot of those ideas, neo-Marxist ideas, they're often called, come from academia and universities. And some of Trump's executive orders and some of his actions since he's been back in the White House have been to directly take on that sort of thinking in American universities, most notably Harvard. Do you think he's had any success there? Do you think those executive orders will bear fruit?
Oh boy, is that a tough question. He's had success to the extent that there are a considerable number of universities who have actually disbanded their diversity bureaucracies. Of course, many of them have merely rebranded them. You have the same diversicrat that was in 2023 promoting books like against assimilation, why you should not try to act like white people. And now he's still there at Case Western Reserve University as a belonging officer. So there's a lot of fast business going on. But there are some schools that seem to have truly made some difference in their, at least in their bureaucracy. But he's also created quite a backlash because his means have been arguably beyond the legal authority that he has. He has not followed some arcane statutory and regulatory procedures for defunding universities, for punishing them under our civil rights laws, for discriminating against whites and Asians and Jews. And so he's managed, frankly, in many not just conservative circles or not just left-wing circles, to make Harvard look like a virtuous David standing up against the thuggish Goliath, just because Trump's crusade against it is so arguably over the top. And I agree with Trump's analysis of universities 100%. I and others, it's not just me, have been sounding the alarm for 40 years about the fact that these institutions have totally betrayed their primary responsibility, which is to pass on a cultural inheritance with love and gratitude, and to educate students to the point that they can realize how unbelievably fortunate they are to be the recipients of so much beauty, so much sublimity, and so much brilliant conquest of natural mysteries and oppression by poverty, by disease. But that having been said, I wish Trump were proceeding with a bit more caution. And I also think, to be perfectly honest, that he is using the anti-Semitism charge very pretextually. It is a stand-in for something that is much deeper, and a lot of his measures have nothing to do with anti-Semitism, yet that is the banner under which most of this is flying, and I think that's a mistake.
That's very interesting what you say about using anti-Semitism pretextually. Is that because in the world that we live in, one has to assume the language of an oppressed minority in order to get anything done? One has to talk in terms of oppression in order to combat the type of thinking that exists across American universities?
Well, I think it's yes, but I would say I might substitute a different set of victims, and I'm always reluctant to do anything. The left is always going to accuse you of, well, you're playing the victim card if you point out just some factual aspects of our world, like if you're a straight white male trying to get into a selective college, you are completely penalized. That's just fact. That's not playing the victim. The reality in our world today is black privilege, not white privilege. There's not a single mainstream institution, whether in academia or in the business world, that is not tying itself into knots to try and hire and promote as many remotely qualified blacks as it can. But white males have a very hard time getting into medical school, into law schools today. So I would actually say that there is a denigration within universities of a culture and of certain individuals, but it's much broader than anti-Semitism. It's as you know very well, Freddie, because you've been articulating this, it's a hatred for the entirety of Western civilization. The primary attitude of academia today is what the philosopher Paul Ricoeur called the hermeneutics of suspicion. Anything it takes up from the West will be done in order to deconstruct it, to show that it's a power play. And so that's the key fact of universities today. The idea that their primary characteristic is anti-Semitism, I just think that's a bit facile. Yes, there are totally ignorant students that are involved in this group mania of conformity, to feel like they are united against a enemy, which is Israeli Zionism, and that they are defending this underdog, which is the Palestinians. These students know nothing about the history. It is completely an ignorant reaction. But that, I think, that is going on. There are professors who encourage it. There is certainly a circumambient ideology against so-called, colonialism. We are in a post-colonial world. But let's be honest, Jews per se, in hiring, they're not discriminated against the way they were 70 years ago. It's not that they're not being promoted because they're not seen as clubbable in the WASP Country Club in Greenwich, Connecticut. If they're not getting hired or promoted, it's not because they're Jewish. It's because they're white and they're male and they don't fit into the intersectional categories. So, I don't believe that Alan Garber, the acting president of Harvard, is anti-Semitic and he is Jewish, but or his bureaucrats are. Now, some people in the diversity bureaucracies, those intersectional individuals, there's probably quite a few who are more conventionally anti-Semitic, and that correlates with being black. Let's face it, there has been historically anti-Semitism in the black community, and you see that now in the anti-Israel movement. But generally, I think that what ails the universities is not anti-Semitism; it's anti-Westernism. It's a complete just violation of their entire reason for being.
To what extent does that anti-Westernism overlap with anti-whiteism? Because I mean, if a government were to try and take up, the sort of the whites of rights, it would quickly be accused of being white supremacist and so on. So, to what extent can Americans really talk about the hatred of white people in a fair-minded way?
It's absolutely tantamount. They are the same thing. Anti-Westernism and anti-whiteism are identical. And yes, it is very interesting to see what's happening in the Trump administration. Uh, One of his main aides is Stephen Miller, who was involved in the first Trump administration. He started out working for Jeff Sessions, who was our strongest immigration hawk in the Senate. Sessions was Trump's first attorney general in his first um, administration, and then Trump, in one of his typical adolescent tantrum fits, fired him. Sessions put in many of the pro-border policies that are now being reinstated in the second Trump administration, and he also put a real limitation on police consent decrees, which again has also been recently done by the current head of civil rights in the Justice Department, Harmeet Dillon. Stephen Miller was a border hawk during Trump 1. Then in the interim period, he founded a private law firm, a nonprofit law firm that did litigate on behalf of and try to tear down anti-white policies in government and in private sector. And now he's back in the administration, and you have Trump with his recent executive order, I think it was, or maybe it was came out of the State Department, I don't know, saying that, well, we're going to grant Boers, Afrikaners in South Africa, asylum status because they're living through something close to a genocide in South Africa with the overt war on their land holding and murders. And this has created just an absolute level of hysteria in the American media. He's playing white politics. How dare he say that whites could ever be the victims of discrimination? This was foreseen. This moment was foreseen years ago by the race hustlers in academia, who came out with this formula saying that there can never be, by definition, there can never be discrimination against whites, because discrimination is a combination of power and privilege. And because whites have power and privilege, they can never be discriminated against. It's only blacks who can ever be discriminated against. And so that would, come into play again here with the left saying that by definition, no white can ever be the victim of discrimination. So Trump is coming very close, and may have in passing at various moments, to saying, yes, in fact, it's white people who are the targets of discrimination today. And I would like to see that go further, frankly. As a matter of pure logic, if every other group gets identity politics, it as a matter of pure completeness in your conceptual scheme, why shouldn't white people? Either we none of us have this, and let's just get rid of the whole stinking schema whatsoever, or let's make it universal, and every group gets to claim some kind of identity solidarity, and be able to say that our culture had something to offer, which is clearly the case. Western civilization happened to be demographically white. It came out of Europe. That's just the facts, folks. You can't change that historically. Yet no civilization has done as much for world humanity as the West. That too is just objectively true. When you look at the pace of scientific and technological development that began in Britain, in the Royal Society in London in the 17th century, and then just picked up steam and went gangbusters in Britain in the 18th and 19th century with the Industrial Revolution and the conquest of biological ignorance. It's stunning. Everything we look at in our world today is a product of Western innovation, and our political theories are also a product of Western civilization. And I mean the theories that the left fights in the name of equality and tolerance. Those are uniquely Western ideas. And yet we're only allowed to say that we're the source of oppression. And again, like, you've got some great thinkers there, Nigel Bigger, who has exploded that myth, and we should know that every other civilization has been as imperialistic, as ruthless, as cruel, as slavery perpetrating as the West, but they all get a free pass.
Well, I suppose another thing that Western civilization has created is this self-criticism that sometimes pushes it towards self-destruction.
To me, this is the big question of our time. What is it about the West that has led to this suicide, that has led to this obsessive focus on its largely phantom sins? Where did it begin? Does it begin with Plato? Does it begin with the idea of philosophy as a critique of received concepts, that you cannot take any authority for granted? Now, obviously, authority had a very strong hold on Western societies, on nations, on thought throughout the next 2,000 years. It wasn't as if Plato turned everybody into knee-jerk deconstructionists, and you had the authority of the church for a very long time. You had authority of um, of absolute monarchs, but still you did have a tradition that waned and ebbed and flowed, but that kept up, of self-analysis, of philosophy. So maybe that was the start of this, or maybe it wasn't. Maybe we could have kept some beneficial and deserved attitude of self-critique and not have gone completely bonkers into this state of self-cancellation. So did it begin, other possibilities? Did it begin with World War I and the sense of futility about the ideals that the West had believed in before? Did it begin in World War II and Germany's travesty of its own self? Or did it begin with, but I would say, did it begin with racial guilt? But we're the only ones who feel racial guilt. Africa doesn't feel racial guilt about selling its own people into slavery, into the fact that it took the British Navy to blockade Lagos for it to decouple itself from the slave trade in the 1860s. It's, to me, this, you've asked the main puzzle. What is it about the West that has resulted in this unique lie about its own unique perfidy?
Is it perhaps just civilizational exhaustion that we are reaching the end of a very long period of Western civilization, and therefore the West is starting to kill itself?
Well, we did Rome actually turn on itself intellectually as it was collapsing? Did it say that it deserved to die? I doubt it. I think that this, the rhetoric and the thinking is unprecedented. I don't know, and who knows what the signs are for a civilization collapsing. I would say, in a sense, it's sort of tautological. You're describing the thing you're trying to explain, using that as an explanation. If we didn't have this self-annihilation, this obsession with our racial guilt, would we be in a state of collapse? Not necessarily. I don't know. Although, I mean, the other aspect of modernity that one can point out is the growth of bureaucracy, the loss of autonomy, the loss of individual autonomy, the fear of taking risks, the feminization of everything, females taking over universities. And that's a very worrisome thing, because females on average are less rational thinkers. They are more prone to one of the 5 big psychological traits, which is neuroses. And they have not been the ones who gave us civilization. They were nurturers. That is their comparative advantage. and maybe peacemakers as well. I don't know. And again, I'm speaking of averages here. I'm not speaking of anybody's daughter who is plunging ahead in a stellar engineering career. But on average, there are real differences, both psychologically and intellectually. And the modern trend of civilization does seem to be uh, feminizing. So these are very, very big topics, and I do think about them all the time, but I don't have the knowledge myself to come up with a single answer. And we know there's these phenomena that are multi-causal, uh, and and that's frustrating because you do want a much more simple explanation, but it just may be that there's so many things feeding into this that it's hard to tease any one of them out.
Going back to the Trump administration, you mentioned that amazing press conference in the Oval Office last week with South African President Cyril Ramaphosa. And that seemed to me to be part of something that's happening within the Trump administration, which is a kind of adopting of left-wing tactics to advance right-wing causes, to put it oversimply. But this is something Christopher Rufo, who I think has some influence over the administration, is quite keen on. And when you hear Trump didn't actually use the term white genocide, but the people around him have done. When you hear people talking about white genocide, genocide is a very politicized word, and it's one that the left traditionally has used to advance its own agendas and its own race politics. So is that what's happening here? Is that the Trump administration is inverting DEI to its advantage? And is that necessarily a good thing to do?
Well, I don't know if this is some deliberate plan. I think he's using the terms that are ready to hand. Um, and it's just, I would say it's more of an empirical description. Now, genocide, again, as you say, is very loaded. And obviously the right is upset about that as a description of what Israel is doing. And so I suppose one could quibble on good grounds with, is that really what's going on in South Africa? Um, Trump is so impulsive in his language. I don't know whether it represents a strategy that his speechwriters told him, get that phrase out here. So I think one can overthink this or claim that we've got this, we're going to follow some script. We're going to follow some script that they used to infiltrate the long march through the institutions, and we're going to do the same thing. I think that's often rhetorically rationalizing the real. I think that political actions are often taken at the moment, and they don't represent some long-term plan. I also don't believe that there was a long-term plan on the left. I think this evolved spontaneously and organically, the left-wing takeover. Nobody set their sights on the universities. So I disagree with that narrative, and I disagree with the narrative that we're going to have some plan to take it all back. I think you fight the battles one by one, and you point out the facts of the world, which is that there is Black privilege, not white privilege. There's female privilege, not male privilege. And you point that out, and you hope that people agree with you.
Finally, Heather, 5 years on from Black Lives Matter, it seems to me in that summer where you had politicians winking or even actively encouraging violence, you had a kind of mania take hold that a lot of clear-thinking people found very disturbing. It hasn't got a lot worse from there, I think it's fair to say. Perhaps it did after defund the police, the violence in cities carried on. And as you said at the beginning, criminality has now become accepted to a large extent. But we're not quite at the sort of point of crisis that we seemed to be 5 years ago.
That's true. But there's still, as I say, there's still outbreaks of anarchy. So yes, cities are not burning at the moment. And frankly, um, I'm enough of a pessimist that I thought if Trump were elected, that cities would burn again. And I was very glad to be in California for the election and not in New York, because and cities were boarding up, and that didn't happen, and that was curious to me. So yeah, we're not in flames. I guess we could celebrate that, but we still have police forces that are decimated, that are um, way down in numbers because morale is so low. We still have rules saying that police can't make traffic stops because that would be racially discriminatory, which is again BS. We still have colorblind neutral technologies being disbanded, like uh, shooting acoustical sensors called Shot Spotter. They can't be used because they're racist, because they show that most shootings occur in black neighborhoods, and so the acoustical audio sensors are racist. We're getting rid of red light cameras because they show that blacks speed more. Those must be racist cameras. So I guess I tend to look on the dark side of things. I still see a lot that is based on the phony premise of uh, that racial disparities per se reveal the existence of deliberate racial discrimination. Uh, but there is pushback happening. There are cities that have said we want the cops to be proactive again. In the last election in California, one of the worst of the racializing district attorneys, Pamela Price in Alameda County, which is the county seat is Oakland. This is on the East Bay, east of San Francisco. She was recalled. The LA County District Attorney, George Gascon, and district attorneys are sort of the lead prosecutors. They're the ones that bring criminal cases. George Gascon was also one that said, I'm not prosecuting a whole bunch of crimes because if I do so, I will prosecute black criminals, and therefore my prosecutors must be racist and the laws will be racist. So we're just not going to prosecute. We're going to decriminalize everything. He was lost in an election. That was good, and Californians passed a voter initiative that was pushing back against an initiative that had decriminalized shoplifting. So there has been movement back towards sanity. I would definitely agree with that. But and you have Trump uh, saying we're not going to have disparate impact standards any longer. That is the best thing that he's done so far, the most far reaching, if he can get that to stick. So yes, there's been progress, and my hope is that the next time a would-be race grifter stands up and says all you white people are to blame and you're guilty, and the reason that there's racial disparities at Google AI department is you're discriminating against black computer scientists. I would hope people just shout that or laugh that person down. We'll see. We'll see if the spell of racial victimology has truly ended.
Well, on that almost optimistic note, we will end it there. Thank you very much, Heather, for coming on to Americana.
Thank you so much.